Hello, and thank you for joining our policy webinar series. We have Battle 3, which is the impact of not having critical race theory in social institutions and our social responsibility. Okay, so it looks like we are going to wait on a few more attendees before we get started. So just stay tuned. Okay, so we will get started. I would like to introduce our three speakers. Okay, so we have Dr. Phia Salter, who is a graduate of Davidson College, where she earned her BS in psychology in 2005. She returned to Davidson in 2019 after gaining her master's and PhD in social psychology from the University of Kansas and spending several years teaching and conducting research at Texas A&M University. She is a proud graduate of North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics. Her research utilizes cultural, psychological, and critical race perspectives to inform her work on collective memory, social identity, and systemic racism. Throughout her research, one can find an integration of testing basic research theory and applications to socially relevant issues. She is also dedicated to social justice initiatives for teaching and learning. She teaches courses in cultural psychology, Black psychology, and history of psychology. In the classroom, she facilitates dialogue, critical thinking, and action that empowers students to identify, challenge, and dismantle various forms of oppression and injustice. In 2018, she was awarded an Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award from SPICY, a professional organization that advances the integration of activist scholarship and public policy. So she will be speaking on the article that she co-authored, which is called CRT and the Social Psychology Behind the Backlash, which was published in Spitzy's Journal of Social Issues. Our next speaker is Alaina Brenick, and she is a scholar activist who identifies as white, queer, disabled, Jewish cis woman. Currently, she is an associate professor of human development and family sciences at the University of Connecticut. She received a pre-doctoral traineeship from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to obtain her PhD at the University of Maryland prior to her postdoctoral fellowship at Friedrich, I hope I'm
Friedrich
pronouncing
Schiller.
it. Okay, Friedrich Schiller
Got you.
University, thank you, of Jena, Germany. Through a social justice lens, she analyzes how diverse social groups, sometimes with vastly different societal structures, norms, and expectations, experience, reason about, and respond to intergroup relations, group-based victimization, and systemic discrimination. Furthermore, her scholarship utilizes a social ecological framework to analyze the micro and macro system influences on these factors and is designed to be applied directly to policy practice and social action. Dr. Brenick's work provides a fundamental knowledge base for creating multifaceted, contextually, and developmentally appropriate intervention programs, ranging from mindfulness training to intergroup contact, which is designed to promote compassion, empathy, social equity, and positive intergroup relations. Recently, with Dr. Courtney Bonab, Roxanne Moadel-Attie, if I'm pronouncing that right, Andrea Miller and Phia Salter, she co-edited a 2-volume special issue of Journal of Social Issues on Critical Race Theory and the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Dr. Brenick prioritizes service that drives anti-bias, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice in the field. Presently, she is the Secretary Treasurer for SPICY, serves on the Inclusion, Equity, and Social Justice Committee, and the Social Cultural Data Tracking Initiative Advisory Board. And she is a founding member of the Social Cultural Data Tracking Initiative Advisory Anti-Racism Ally White Working Group. Okay, and so our next speaker that we have is Dr. Roxanne Moadel-Attie, and she's currently a program analyst in the U.S. Census Bureau. She is a social psychologist who completed her doctoral program at Stony Brook University. Her research interests lie at the intersections of social identity, intergroup relations, and public policy. So I want to thank all the speakers for being here, and I will hand it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for bringing us here today. So as you introduced us, Dr. Salter, Dr. Moadel-Attie, myself, Andrea Miller, and Courtney Bonham came together a couple of years ago with the idea of proposing a special issue to the Journal of Social Issues on critical race theory in psychological science. We were overwhelmed with the number and quality of submissions. So we ended up having a 2-volume special issue. And you can see the QR codes on the page right now that you can access the articles. Many of them are open access. If you're not members of SPICY. If you are members of SPICY, you can access all of them. So we came together to really bring a number of different perspectives on these issues and really explore where are we so many decades later when CRT was introduced, and then when CRT really made its way into psychological science with James Jones' foundational piece in 1998. So we welcome you all to look at the resources that we're very proud to have collected. The QR code that you have right now is our introductory chapter for the first volume. And we hope that it helps kind of shed some light on how psychology has really been able to take the tenets of CRT and explore that within our psychological realities.
So what brings us here today is the discussion about how CRT has been banned in many states or local educational systems. And one of the things that was clear to us and many others who have sort of critiqued this sort of anti-CRT movement is that people are using CRT as a label, not necessarily knowing what it is, although they seem pretty sure that it must be bad without necessarily understanding exactly the conversations that are happening both within CRT and around it. And so we just wanted to first just really make sure we're all on the same note, understanding that, right, CRT is coming out of legal studies, and it does come with a specific set of intellectual theory and understanding of how racism is both informing our broader society and the law. And these insights from CRT has trickled down or expanded into many other fields, both inside and outside of psychology. As we're psychologists here, we're going to kind of focus on how psychology has thought about CRT and some of the implications for us. And so one of the things you may be interested in, if you want to sort of trace the chronology of CRT insights into psychology, you could start with an article that was published in a SPICY journal. So Dr. James Jones in 1998 talked about psychological critical race theory and how we could understand some of the insights that were emerging in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and how there's research within psychology that really supports many of the claims in terms of how racism continues to manifest, even as we might assert colorblindness or post-racial society, or that we've really gone beyond a need of this critical lens. And we were also fortunate enough that Dr. Jones contributed a reflection on, what were the circumstances around him writing the article in 1998, and how psychology has and hasn't necessarily picked up critical race theory as a main line of study, and how it continues to be relevant today through his eyes. And you can also see a QR code at the bottom if you'd like access to that article. So one of the things both that you'll find common within critical race theory, but also critical race psychology or other manifestations of how critical race theory kind of shows up in psychology, are a few common themes and core ideas, including thinking about racism as systemic and as embedded in our society, as sort of everyday versus an abnormal occurrence, right? It's being sort of perhaps hard to see because it is everyday versus a rare occurrence. Also emphasizes the importance of listening to and paying attention to people of color, because they may have unique perspectives informed by the histories and experiences of oppression, and that these experiences may sometimes be foreign to many white people, and that really listening and understanding those perspectives are going to be important in understanding the phenomena at hand. Counter storytelling is one way to think about resisting how racism is functioning in our society, really understanding not just the everyday narratives that we tell about racism. For example, racism is going down, but thinking about those experiences and the flip side of some of those narratives. Also asserts that race and racial hierarchies are socially constructed, talks about interest convergence, this idea that broad support for racial justice only typically emerges when it aligns with the interests of white Americans. It also highlights how neoliberal discourses today help reproduce racism in society. So thinking about individualism, narratives around choice and merit, how those things reinforce the structures that are in place. And then finally, thinking about intersectional experiences of oppression, right? That racism doesn't happen outside of other matrices of marginalization or oppression, that these things really work together.
So how did CRT come to the forefront of our, political agenda, so to speak? So it came to a head on September 4th, 2020, when the Executive Office of President Trump, as many of you know, issued a memorandum directing federal agencies to cease and desist funding to federal training programs, and included anything related to critical race theory or CRT. And so essentially this memo mentioned press reports that were, related to CRT, saying that they were divisive anti-American propaganda trainings, and declared that the CRT movement is contrary to all that we stand for as Americans and should have no place in the federal government. So there's a lot of conversation in the media and online claims about the dangers of CRT. And it's pretty clear that the moral panic is coming or has already come. And the opposition to a robust legal literature and bans on teaching CRT in schools, as you can see here, essentially boils down to the question, but what about the children? Have you thought about the children? And so we're going to address that later in this conversation. Before we attempt to answer this question, what is there to be afraid of? And that's kind of what we want to address in our conversation with you. So I think we have to address the public's fears at the center of this debate. As we've seen many times when asked to define CRT or the true reasons for why individuals are against it being taught in schools, many of its opponents draw a blank. They're not really sure what it means or why exactly they're against it. So according to Bell, an expert on CRT, CRT is a body of legal scholarship, and it's now, a majority of members who support CRT essentially are people who are people of color, ideologically committed to the struggle against racism, particularly as institutionalized in and by law. Those critical race theorists who are white are usually cognizant of and committed to the overthrow of their own racial privilege. So this is really the definition that we want to understand, embody, and communicate. And yes, of course, there are tenets to critical race theory, as we discussed with the Jim Jones paper. But at its foundation, it's a critical identity conscious movement, and interventions in legal studies now expanded to other domains.
Thanks. And as the developmentalist here, I will definitely be talking about the children in a few slides and really talking about those fears. But first, what is it, right? So what is it that is being targeted in these legislative acts? And what we may all be kind of familiar with is the term divisive concepts, right? A nice vague term that can really be the kitchen sink of anything that folks in power are trying to make sure that we don't access. This is another way that we're engaging in stereotyping, we're engaging in scapegoating, and we're prioritizing the quote unquote realities, or what people assume as realities, and their experiences and the potentials of any negative consequence that would come as a result of talking about these things that folks need to be protected from, over folks who are actually experiencing this. So James Jones, in his paper, this most recent paper from 2024, he talks about how these contested words and issues can really be used as a way to get our eye off the ball. So we're talking about terms like woke. We're talking about terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're talking about intersectionality, that recognition that we fall within multiple identities, and that really creates unique experiences, lived experiences, and narratives. We're talking about words like marginalization, microaggressions. Then we can come into legislation that actually says the words critical race theory, 1619 project, but we also have words in here like guilt and responsibility and meritocracy, really showing that the far-reaching and nefarious goals of these divisive concepts legislation. And by banning these, by saying that we can't talk about them, we can't explore them, we can't engage with them, James Jones argues that we're confusing, conflating, and combating our efforts to find a path forward towards civility and common ground. If we can't even talk about these issues and understand them, then how are we actually going to make the systematic change that we need? So we've seen immediate and longer term effects of these bans that happened. In 2020, Stanford had a checklist to evaluate diversity training so that they could comply. And you can see in this checklist You can't talk about one race or sex inherently being superior or to another race or sex. That there is a fundamental racism or sexism to the United States, that individuals by virtue of their sex or race are inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. So having to go down and tick all those boxes. More recently, we've seen that a number of universities have fired faculty and staff with any tangential connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This has happened at University of Texas, Austin. We've seen this at the University of Florida, Appalachian State University. So we're shutting down the right for folks to engage in this scholarship, to engage in this teaching and training, to have programs that are open and exploring these in free and open conditions.
So one of the things we want to do today briefly is talk about a critical race psychology analysis of the sphere of this sort of movement to ban CRT courses by highlighting some of the assumptions of this resistance to CRT. And, I just like to note that these assumptions that we're going to talk about were developed in collaboration with Jennifer Mueller, Glenn Bracey, and Wendy Moore. And we're going to talk about these assumptions, but not all of them today. We're going to focus on the first three, including there's an assumption among anti-CRT proponents that Americans are hurt rather than helped by uncomfortable racial truths, that children have a racial innocence that must be protected, that colorblindness is a key approach that has characterized America's racial history, and that this is the right approach, that this is a good approach. There's also an assumption about a psychological unity around white American identity, as well as an assumption that individual responsibility and meritocracy principles trump racial equity or any other kind of equitable outcomes. Oh, sorry, I moved ahead without moving the slides. So those are the summary of the 5 assumptions that we're trying to develop. And then here are the 3 that we're going to talk to you a little bit about today. Okay, so the idea that Americans are hurt rather than helped by uncomfortable truths are embedded within some of the documents that were put forth by former President Trump in 2020, including this idea that we should not teach that our heroic men and women in uniform, that the country for which they died for is fundamentally racist. He asserts that such teachings could directly threaten the cohesion and effectiveness of our uniformed services. So this isn't the only place that he talks about this idea that America is hurt rather than helped by uncomfortable racial truths, but there's some social psychological literature that suggests that this is not necessarily true. First, if we think about who is the we implied by we are hurt by uncomfortable racial truths, and it's also on the dimensions of which we might say that people are hurt. So it's not to say that having interracial conversations or talking about racism isn't uncomfortable or can't evoke negative feelings, right? Talking about these issues can be uncomfortable for white and people of color alike, right? It's not an easy conversation to have, particularly because, well, Americans aren't well practiced at it. But what we do find in the literature is that engagement with these uncomfortable truths of our history and how racism was there at the foundation is that engaging with critical history can be associated with collective guilt, which again, you might think of that as a negative emotion. And yet that emotion is linked to being willing to compensate for past wrongdoing, right? To make amends, right? To remedy past injustices. Engaging with critical history or these uncomfortable truths are related to not only how we see racism in the past, but the implications for how it may be manifesting today. And to the extent that you see racism manifesting today, that can facilitate support for anti-racist policies, right? Again, the idea that being able to see a problem means that you're also able to think about solutions or remedies to that problem. And then finally, so we talked about guilt as a potential emotion, but empathy is also facilitated by thinking about these uncomfortable truths and perceptions of privity. This idea that we can directly link the harm doing in the past to current day suffering or current day injustices is an important idea to keep in mind when we say, right, are we hurt by uncomfortable racial truths, but also what is to be gained?
Sorry about that, had to unmute myself. So now I am able to talk to you all a bit more about the second assumption, that white, in parenthetical notation, children have a racial innocence that must be protected. The best way to preserve the story of America's founding principles is to live it in action by local communities reasserting control of how children receive patriotic education in their schools. Okay. So that's a lot to bite into. And what I always like to do when I'm thinking about how children are engaging with this, how we're preventing children from engaging in this, is to go back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, where it is stated fully that children deserve recognition of their inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace. That children shouldn't be discriminated against, should have their best interests accounted for, and have the right to survive and develop authentically in terms of their identity and their lived experiences. And this really pushes back against what is being asserted with this assumption that we can't engage in these conversations. So if we look at the anti-CRT measures that have been enacted, and this is even higher now, what we can see is that 81% of those legislative initiatives target K through 12 education. If we include higher education, that encompasses 90% of the goal for the context in which these anti-CRT measures are being put in place. These are the institutions where we are teaching our future generations how to engage with others, how to understand history, how to understand where we are in our current sociocultural and political experience. We're taking huge pieces of that away with these anti-CRT measures. So do children actually need protection from discussions of racism? So there is this belief that's put across by the proponents of anti-CRT measures that our children are fragile, that they can't handle these conversations about inequity. They can't handle conversations and learning about racism. And from a couple of decades now of my own personal experiences, I've gone into schools, into K through 12 schools. I've talked to children from kindergarten all the way up through high school about these issues, and they're actually eager to engage in these conversations and feel that they are being silenced, that nobody wants to hear their voice and experiences. So we see that it's quite the opposite. We also know that children and young adults, they're not ignorant of racial differences. That's something that society kind of socializes primarily white children into avoiding mentioning that there are differences across different groups of people, particularly marginalized populations. We also know that young children who are from marginalized groups are experiencing these racial differences in inequities in treatment. We see even from pre-K that young Black boys are being expelled, suspended from schools at disproportionately high numbers. So we're seeing this kind of cyclical event where staff and faculty in the schools who are not educated with a CRT lens, with a CRT perspective, are perpetuating and continuing the cycle of these harms to young children, 4 and 5 years old. Okay? So among children who engage with critical history, what we actually see is positive outcomes. We see that there might be negative emotions like sadness, as Phia talked about previously. We see a lot of empathy and compassion that also develops. We see that guilt isn't taken on as this significant contributor. We're not weighing our children down with guilt by having these conversations, by having them engage with these topics. We're actually allowing them to see and understand a diversity of experiences, and it helps perpetuate, or it helps promote this ideology of understanding and of wanting to push back against harms that are befalling other members of their community in systemic ways. They also wind up having a greater understanding and awareness of other types of discrimination and inequity that are being experienced. So what do we need to do? What are some preliminary policy implications that we can take on? So James Jones, again, in his 2024 piece, talks about how fairness is derived from divergent racial experiences. Right? Educational policies that foster children's development need to decenter white children's experiences, because that's who the anti-CRT perspective is prioritizing. We are prioritizing one group of children, white children, assume social and emotional realities. They assume reactions of white children engaging with these topics, though we've just shown that those assumptions do not materialize, over other groups of children's actual social and emotional experiences. We know that those inequities are being experienced from 4 to 5, and that young children from marginalized populations have to be socialized in terms of what to expect for discrimination and oppression. So we're also now putting additional responsibility on parents in these families of teaching children what is not taught in our schools.
So in terms of the third assumption, so the third assumption amongst CRT opponents is that colorblindness is the key approach that has categorized American racial history. So it's an understatement to say that America does not have a long history of colorblindness in practice, right? So this framing ignores the context that in which all men were created equal, setting aside that all men did not have the same rights, nor did women, nor did people of other identities, race or otherwise, right? So we already know that. And although colorblindness on its face appears to be a good approach and was supported by figures in the civil rights movement as an ideal, in practice, it also communicates to people of color that we don't see you or hear you. So it has its own detriments. So as we know, this can lead to implicit biases and discrimination without an opportunity for people of color to clarify their own unique perspectives, leading to racism, denial, and power evasion. And in response to colorblindness, multiculturalism became a dominant approach, particularly within educational context, speaking to what Alaina was just referring to provide individuals the platform to communicate unique racial and ethnic perspectives. Contrary to colorblindness, which psychosocially impacted marginalized individuals in particular, multiculturalism threaten culturally dominant groups. And so we can see that that's the link to CRT. So we can make a direct link to CRT and the foundations for individuals' opposition to it. As CRT provides an avenue for understanding the racial lens through which our institutions, our history, and experience have been designed, written, and lived. So that way we can see how it all culminates and understand that lens. So now that we've provided a glimpse into the motivations behind opposition to CRT and the ways in which this may impact our society, we also would like to encourage you to all take social action. There are a multitude of ways in which we can all make an impact on CRT-related policies within SPICY and otherwise. Here are just a few suggestions or actions that we recommend. So in reference to our recent SPICY conference, you may write op-eds about CRT, offer expertise to journalists and interviews about CRT or related topics. You can engage in our next SPICY's Advocacy Day on Capitol Hill and build relationships with your local representatives. Of course, you can organize, like I'm gonna refer to Alaina on this, organize or participate in email, postcard, and or phone campaign in your city, county, or state. It's a great way to stay involved on any issue, really. You can be an expert witness at a state or county level. You can advocate at your school board meetings at a local level. That's a great way to stay involved at your local level. Within SPICY, you can contact the policy committee or Sam Abbott, he's on our webinar right now, to draft the timely policy brief, which uses psychology and social science research to support a particular public policy or perspective. You can contact me, I'm the VSI editor, to curate a timely journal issue by devising a narrative on a relevant public policy, such as this one, highlighting a few articles published in SPICY journals, make them open access, which is another great policy. So there's many ways to stay involved. Thank you again. You may review our issues. These are the JSI issues we referenced earlier. These are our QR codes. And also you may contact us via email with any lingering questions after the Q&A. I'll refer back to our host.
Yes, thank you so much to our speakers for that wonderful presentation. So now we will move on to our Q&A section. So it looks like, okay, we just have a comment here from Kim Case. She wanted to add to the map of state restrictions that there are also states that appear to have no restrictions when the governor's office has inferred with university curriculum. An example is Virginia. So this extends beyond laws passed.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for that comment. It's insidious because it is manifesting at multiple levels in many different areas, from local to national type of initiatives and efforts. And yeah, you're absolutely correct that it's not just laws, but there are sort of universities and other organizations that are also taking to heart, right? I'm taking to heart this idea that CRT has no place in our society.
I think at the K through 12 level, right, this is also happening in ways where we're seeing expansive book bans or curriculum setting that, you can't take AP in psychology, you can't take AP in sociology, you can't take AP in ethnic studies, right? So if we shift, right, and we allow these experiences to be like a core component of our educational systems, if we see the power of storytelling and counter narratives and simply expose children to different narratives, allow them to read books from different perspectives and voices, not just sit there and say, all right, you're racist, as anti-CRT activists would say, you're racist, feel guilt, give everything back that you have, sort of a thing. But it's simply an acknowledgement of the lived experiences and engaging in a developmentally appropriate way of understanding that your lived experience is not the only one. We can get this from very young age, simply by taking these small steps.
And I think just to add to that, I think other countries have learned this lesson in a different way earlier, in the sense that history is always written by victors, right? So I think in other countries, they have that understanding early on in terms of wars, in terms of conflicts. But we are a fairly young country, so I think we're kind of having those growing pains now and learning from these experiences now.
Okay, so another question that we have. So, what do you believe are some of the long reach consequences to the spread of these bans on CRT?
I suppose one consequence of long-term consequence is that it just, I don't want to say that it stalls racial progress, because that's an awfully optimistic view of our country's history of racial relations, but it certainly helps. You know, if we don't understand what the problem is, it certainly helps justify those disparities that exist, right? And so then there's certainly not the impetus to do anything about it. Or, you know, if we're looking at the disparities of discipline for young Black boys, for example, then that's just happenstance, right? If we try to erase this understanding of how race is actually working in our society, it has the long-term consequences of just continuing to amplify those disparities over time. Like, it's already hard enough to sort of address them so that they might go away. But I think long-term, not having the frameworks or the understanding of how this works only helps to further these disparities and these, you know, whether it's wealth, income, you know, health, economic, like educational. I think it all continues to be terrible.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Phia was saying, and like she and I had mentioned, this disparate discipline that changes the entire trajectory that these young kids have in terms of what are the educational opportunities that are being afforded to them. What is the way in which teachers within systems of education provide opportunities and encourage opportunities of educational growth, right? And also how that disparate disciplinary action is actually what feeds disparate realities in the criminal justice system. It's not, it's quote unquote, it's seen as not being connected to inequities in how we treat these young children in the school to prison pipeline, right? We're ignoring the fact that there's racism at all of these different levels within an individual's social ecology, right? That we have created that pipeline, as opposed to, well, obviously, if this group of individuals is seeing unequal sentencing and unequal arrest, it's obviously their fault, right? So it just hits from one point and hits all different aspects of society and our lived experiences.
And just to tag on to both what Phia and Alaina just mentioned, just on a political standpoint, I think because different states are having kind of opposing views on this, you know, if you saw on the map, some states where have, mandatory CRT education while other states, are banning it, you're going to see, this further divergence, polarization politically, and that's going to result in further identity politics, perhaps. So that's going to affect us politically as well as we move forward, in future decades. I think we have some good Q&A questions that we should attend to as
well. Awesome. Okay, so we have another question. So it says, hello, we were wondering if you think the opposition to CRT based in a perceived innocence of children is unique to CRT, or does it also extend to other issues such as LGBTQI rights, sex education? If so, do you think that changes of the approaches? Do you think that changes any of the approaches we should take?
Hands down, we see the positive and the negative side of that. So when we engage in critical history around racism, we see greater awareness of other types of discrimination and oppression. And we also see that a number of the school-based or education-based divisive concepts and initiatives are targeting LGBTQIA plus populations. Some of the work that I've been doing recently with transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse youth experiences of discrimination in the school, both institutional and interpersonal, are showing that even when we have folks coming from states that have more progressive LGBTQIA plus initiatives, that there's still this complete lack of representation in the educational system, in courses that are being taught, in who folks are being exposed to. And this is when we've got things going, quote unquote, right? So when we have positive pro LGBTQIA legislation, we're still seeing it fall short of what the needs are for our marginalized youth. And I think it also speaks to the fact that CRT sees intersectionality as critical. We cannot parse out all of these different marginalizations and say, oh, well, this is specific to this and this is specific to that. I think CRT gives us that answer that we have to understand and teach about intersectionality as a foundational piece of our existence.
I'll just quickly add that I think we're seeing correlates in terms of states that are having some kinds of bans and some kinds of oppressive legislation. It's not just one group that is being impacted or targeted. I think they're certainly all related. And in the terms of whether it sort of, changes the approach, I would agree with Alaina that really these things are linked. And perhaps there's some additional things to be done, but I don't think it changes the direction of what we should be doing. Like advocacy for all of these different issues, I think matter.
The only thing I'll add to this is talking to the public more. So again, when we were talking about taking social action, I think, of course, publications are very important and research is very important, but getting outside of our academic sphere and connecting with the public. When I talk to everyday people who are not in our sphere and try to communicate what CRT is or what DEI is and the ways in which it's implemented and how that impacts people to understand their point of view, I think that is the real communication that needs to be had. And that's what will eventually, get to the target, if that makes sense, at least from my personal perspective.
Okay, so it looks like we have some more questions in the Q&A. Okay, so one question is, part of this picture is the political power generated by anti-CRT policies. They are speaking to a group that perceives their own victim status. So this was more of a statement. And
I keep speaking up first, but I'll just say, yeah, I agree with this idea that the audience for the anti-CRT rhetoric is certainly an audience that might also endorse notions of reverse racism, or this, I think the commenter put it as like a own victim status, which is somewhat ironic in that this, in the same breath, some of these critiques will also say slavery happened a long time ago, get over it, and yet it's okay for one group to kind of highlight or amplify the ways in which they might be suffering, but not okay for others.
Okay, so it looks like we have another question. Okay, how, if at all, is your research currently addressing this pivotal moment in time where CRT is being attacked?
I'll give an answer, a more general answer in terms of what some of the experiences that I have been having and seeing, and have been engaging with the field kind of more at large. So in doing that, I'm gonna tell a story. So over the summer, I was at the Equity in STEM community convening that is put on every year, and a number of program officers from NSF, faculty members, staff members, all come together to talk about the work that is being done to enhance equity in STEM. And a vast majority of all of our conversations went not just from what we were doing and what we were finding, but how we need to actually frame the work that we're doing so that in states like Florida, in states like Texas, our funding doesn't get cut off. Our ability to engage in that work doesn't get cut off. So even doing something as small as refraining from diversity and equity in the terminology that you use to describe your program, your center, your institute, your scholarship has shifted. And folks were passing around different terms that they've used that their university legal team has said do not violate anti-CRT laws in those states. So coming up with terms like inclusive excellence. Inclusive is still somewhat okay for right now, but even just having to shift your focus, dependent upon where you are, to use words that allow you to even still do this work, that allow you to engage in your academic freedom of teaching, training, and scholarship. So I think that that's a key way that scholarship has had to shift and pivot and affect our colleagues in specific pockets of the US right now.
I will also add a general thing, which is highlighting the work that people are doing related to CRT and bringing more psychologists into the conversation around CRT is one of the sort of motivators for the special issue that we kind of plugged at the beginning. And I know Roxanne, maybe I'm putting these words into your mouth, but the notion that there could be a virtual issue also highlighting these issues is another way to sort of think about how research can currently address this pivotal moment. And then I'll also make a plug for myself in terms of like motivated to like get some writing done. So the assumptions that we talked about are a paper in development. And so, just making sure that this conversation doesn't fall by the wayside because it may not impact me because I'm at a university where they're not banning CRT, or I'm in a state where they're enhancing curriculum for work that addresses racism and oppression, just to sort of keep these conversations at the forefront. Because not everyone has the luxury. And so, to the extent that we can name and speak up and advocate for those scholars who are in these precarious situations, is another way I sort of see the research informing this pivotal moment.
And to reaffirm what Phia said, yes, if you're interested in writing a VSI issue on CRT, please do email me.
Okay, so it looks like we have time for one more question. Okay, so this is from Kimberly Brown. She says, I read once that part of what contributes to the fear of CRT is that white people have few opportunities to discuss race and racism. The last time most children of any background talk about difference and diversity in the US comes when they do a module on world history in the 6th grade. As a result, white people talk about race like children do. Example, can I touch your hair? Do you ever get sunburned, etc.? Do you agree?
I have to say, and I'm going to push your point even a little bit farther, or further, excuse me. As Roxanne talked about, history is written by the victors, right? So that world history unit in 6th grade is coming already from a biased perspective, and it's interesting because when we see children engage in discussions about race and learning about race, primarily white parents will very quickly try and silence those questions and those conversations, right? With young kids noticing that our skin tones are actually different colors, that hair is different, and asking curiously, like, why is our skin color a different color than theirs? And immediately, what happens in kind of white non-socialization is to stop those conversations from happening with young children, as opposed to allowing an engagement and understanding of the fact that race and differences they aren't things that we need to shy away from, that we can engage in developmentally appropriate ways in a conversation across our lifespan that will enable us to delve into these topics in a much more meaningful and realistic way. I would definitely agree that we particularly white folks and white families quell that ability from very early on with children.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions or any more comments from our speakers. I would like to thank you all for attending and participating, and definitely a shout out to all of our speakers today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you. I hope everyone has a great day and yeah, a great week.
Take care.